Thank you, Barry. I'm very pleased to be here, and thank you very much for the invitation. I should say that I can't claim anything for a second home because I don't have one, so solves that. But I happen to have the seat next door to somebody called Margaret Moran, and the contrast was rather extreme, so they wrongly portrayed me as a saint, and I don't claim to be anything like that myself. I'm very pleased to come along and talk about what some people call Europe. I call European Union because Europe is a continent of wonderful countries. The European Union is a political and economic construct imposed upon some of those countries, or most of them. And I think I like to make that distinction constantly because the Euro enthusiasts, some call them Euro fanatics, constantly talk about Europe when they're talking about the European Union, which are two different things. But I have a track record. I hope you don't object to my Euroscepticism because it's very deep and goes back a long way. In 1975, I was the agent for the no vote in Bedfordshire in the referendum, and the agent for the yes vote was Trevor Skeet MP. He was the MP for Bedford, a Conservative MP. And many years later, about 10 years ago, I met him. He's passed away now, but I met him some 10 years ago, and I reminded him of our previous meeting. And he was horribly embarrassed because he didn't like to be reminded that he had been a Euro enthusiast at that time and had changed his mind. But I haven't changed my mind, I may say, and I'm always surprised, actually, the predictions I make about what has happened in the European Union over the last 30 and 40 years constantly come true. I shall dwell on some of these things. I must say that on economics, I agree entirely with what's just been said by Derek. His analysis, I think, is first class and very powerful, and I've yet to hear anybody come up with an answer to that. My analysis is very similar, and in some ways, I think we have had parallel lives and have had some influence is much greater than mine on developments. After 1975, I continued my Euroscepticism in a kind of rational, practical way, and I constantly argued about economics. And I remember one fellow researcher, I worked for NALGO, the trade union, and a fellow researcher who was also going to be an economist, and I was putting the rational case against what the European Union was doing, or the European Common Market, or one of its incarnations. And he said, "I don't care what you say, I'm a gut European," and he put his fingers in his ears because he didn't want to hear what I was saying. Well, I wanted to tell him I'm a gut European too. I'm very European culturally. I'm born in Europe. I'm European historically. My ancestors for 2,000 years, I think, probably came from Europe. And I'm absolutely in favour of a wonderful future for Europe, but not for the European Union, which is actually causing terrible damage to Europe and to the great countries and peoples of Europe. So I agree entirely with what Derek's been saying. But my predictions, I may say in 1990, I wrote a piece just before Britain went into the exchange rate mechanism, saying it would be a terrible mistake, it would go wrong, and it would eventually be strangled by the money markets. And I wrote this on the front page of the then called NALGO News. I've still got a copy at home. And my predictions were completely rubbished by almost everybody who saw me. There was a kind of unanimity of view from the trade union congress right across to Downing Street. Everybody was saying ERM was a wonderful thing, it was going to be one, and I said it would be a disaster, and it proved to be a disaster. Indeed, I've made those arguments some time before, because in 1979, when I was, that was sort of 1990 for the ERM, 1979, Britain was toying with the idea of joining the EMS, an early version of the ERM currency, the snake, and the European Monetary System, as it was called. And Dennis Healey was Chancellor. I don't know if Derek was working for him at that time, but I wrote a very, very strong critique of this proposal, gave it to my General Secretary, Geoffrey Dray, who was on the TUC General Council's Economic Committee. He went along with my piece of paper, banged the table and said it would be a disaster to sign up to the EMS. They went along to Dennis Healey, the TUC Economic Committee, went along to Dennis Healey, said we mustn't join the EMS. And we didn't join the EMS. Now, I'm sure Derek had much more influence than I did, but at least I had some say in that. And Geoffrey came back and said, they agreed with my view, because I put it very strongly in the terms you put in your note. So I'd like to think I had some influence at that stage. But when I made my predictions about the exchange rate mechanism some 10 years later, in 1990, again, I was my views were completely rejected across the trade union movement, across my political party, which had done a sort of flip-flop over to become Euro-fanatic because of Jacques Delors. And I said, well, look, I'm sorry, let's see what happens. And of course, 2 years later, we had an economic disaster. Unemployment rose. The Conservatives lost they lost massive support, which led directly to the election of Tony Blair and the new Labour government in 1997. It was what I call Golden Wednesday, some people call Black Wednesday, which caused the damage to the Conservative support. If you want to believe that, look at the opinion poll results, the way they switched at that time from giving tentative support to the major government to complete opposition after the collapse. And so, in a sense, although I was right, nobody took any notice. Although when it did happen, 1 or 2 people did remember I had made this prediction and came along and congratulated me. But the Euro-federalists carried on. I mean, they then captured New Labour. And again, I was wholly opposed to the designs of Tony Blair in Europe, in the European Union. And by some miracle, we managed to persuade, or someone managed to persuade, Gordon Brown not to join the Euro. I think it was a battle between Blair and Brown at that time. But he did not sign Britain up to the Euro. Had we joined the Euro at that time, it would have been catastrophic for our economy. We have difficulties now, but they are as of nothing that compared with what would have happened had we joined the Euro. We would have been kind of Ireland or Greece writ large, unable to depreciate. And if you look, it's only because we cut our interest rates to almost zero, we substantially depreciated, and we printed money in effect to reflate the economy, that we escaped from that terrible crisis at all. Had we not been able to do those 3 things, we would have been really in a crisis the like of which we've not seen before. So that's where we were, I think, on the economy. But there are other aspects to the European Union which I think are nonsense. One of which is the common agricultural policy. Imposing an agricultural policy across a whole range of nations with very different industries for the sake of the French, essentially. I mean, they're obsessed with the CAP. And it's been to Britain's massive disadvantage, and we've become very substantial net contributors to the budget simply as a result of the CAP. And of course the Bruges Group came about, I think, because Mrs. Thatcher made a speech which led to Britain having something of a rebate. Tony Blair gave away some of that rebate, but nevertheless we got a rebate which has happened since then, and quite right too. But it's not just about nationalism, it's about having a nonsensical agricultural policy. My own view is that we should have agricultural policy given back to the member states so they can adjust their policy according to their own needs and their own industry. I mean, each country would then decide whether or not it wants to subsidise bits of agriculture. You know, keeping Welsh hill farmers going or whatever is one thing, but giving massive subsidies to the grain farmers of East Anglia may not be sensible. But that's one. And how much we buy, how much we trade in agricultural products, how much we defend agriculture because it's strategically important and we don't want to be isolated without enough food and so on. All those things. But each country had very different agricultural sectors, and they should be allowed to make their own policy. Over time, they might adjust and come closer together. But the CAP is running into deeper trouble because the Eastern European nations are being phased in, if you like, to the CAP. Now, when they had very low wages, this was going to be difficult, but not so difficult. What's happened, of course, is that wages have risen in these Eastern European countries, so the cost of bringing all those countries into the CAP is going to be very high indeed. And guess who's going to pay a lot of the bill? Of course, it'll be Britain and the net contributors like ourselves. So I think the CAP is a nonsense. I wrote this in 1980. Again, I was batted round the room. I wrote a paper for the National Executive Committee of NALGO saying that the CAP was nonsense. And I was actually supported by the Consumers Association. They wrote a very substantial book saying why it was nonsense. And I used that in my argument. But I was nevertheless batted round the room because the National Executive Council was dominated by people who experienced the war and thought that the only way of avoiding war again was to have the European Union, the common market, whatever. So whatever the arguments about it, It was anything that seemed to be critical was rejected. But I had two left-wing Scots who supported me, but the rest of the NEC didn't. My paper was rubbish and put away. I still got it at home, and I still think it's right, but there we are. And then finally, I mean, there's another aspect of the European Union which I speak on frequently, and that's the common fisheries policy, which is the ultimate nonsense. It has led directly to overfishing, the collapse of fish stocks, and the lunacy of thousands of tons of discards every year. I absolutely believe that only when a nation controls its own fisheries will it look after those fisheries properly. If they are open house for every other nation to fish in them, and not because we're being nationalistic or selfish, but the only way to guarantee that they are properly protected and looked after for everybody's benefit is if nations control their own fisheries. I've suggested that we ought to suggest to the European Union that they abolish the common fisheries policy, and if they refuse to do that, to give notice that at that point, maybe 5 years hence, we should withdraw the common fisheries policy unilaterally and reimpose 200-mile limits of median line between countries. You know, just that suggestion. I've also made the point to our former representative of the Britain's diplomatic representative of the European Commission, came to see our committee some weeks ago, and I said we have a number of opt-outs. He said, yes, we have opt-outs in Euro, and a number of other opt-outs on border controls and so on. I said, well, would it not be possible to perhaps negotiate one or two other opt-outs, in particular the common fisheries policy? And he immediately changed his demeanour and said, no, absolutely no. Britain would be expelled from the European Union if that happened. But I do believe, I mean, it wouldn't worry me that much, I say, but there we are. But, you know, I'm absolutely convinced that the only way to have sensible fisheries policies is when member states look after their own waters, and we trade in fish as we would do. And the example, of course, is Norway. Norway controls its own fisheries. Every fishing boat, every fishing catch is monitored because it all comes back to Norway. And they have, of course, I know fish swim, and you can say that fish will swim in and out of the waters, but nevertheless the fisheries around Norway are much better stocked than ours, simply because they're not overfished, because the Norwegians have control of their own fishing waters. And you know, people say, oh, the Euro enthusiasts say, well, we're not Norway, we're interested in this tiny little country. Well, you know, the same arguments apply. I'm sure our fisheries would recover if we could maintain control of our own fisheries. So I make those three arguments. But a more general argument I make is that Derek has talked about the political class, if you like, the nomenclatura in the European Union. I come across them time and time again. And even, you know, politicians as well, not just the administrators, the bureaucrats, but the politicians. And I talk about economics, and they said, well, it's not about economics, it's about politics. I said, well, not economics. Well, why do you have a single currency, which is enforced by so many nations? Why do you have a central bank, which is deliberately kept out of democratic control? Why do you have inflict a single interest rate across all of those nations when each nation should have different interest rates according to its own needs? Why do you insist upon controls, some controls even, on fiscal policy and a creeping gradual move towards a European Union fiscal policy as well? And they look puzzled. They can't understand why I'm asking these questions. And I said, well, look, if you want to prove it's not about economics, get rid of all of those things, and then say, well, it's only about politics. It's actually about economics and politics combined. And they know very well that the kind of political control they want will not happen unless they get control of the economies as well. But I've argued this case constantly, often in a rather simplistic way, as I'm an innocent sort of chap who knows something about these things. But when somebody says it's not about economics, and they insist upon a single currency, a central bank out of democratic control, interest rate being inflicted across lots of different nations, and controls in so many other ways of economic activity, I say that's bunkum. It is about economics, and it's about a mad economic control as well. I think that the future for the European Union, or for Europe, let's talk about Europe, the real future for Europe can only work to our benefit if we take away these constraints, these structures, and work again towards a different kind of Europe. I think a Europe built on an association of, a looser association of independent democratic states, nation states, working together for mutual benefits on a voluntary basis. I'm sure we can do that, with each having their own control of their own economies, adjusted according to their own needs. And of course, if each country can work successfully economically separately, then the collective effect will be beneficial as well. Defer to Derek is what he said about economics. I agree entirely with what he said. I hope that my support will please you here, even though, of course, I'm not of your general political persuasion. It's interesting, I will say this once, that some weeks ago I was made the Freedom Association's Backbencher of the Week. And on the very same day, I was praised for the same speech in the Morning Star. So that's